From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's ahead. Over from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen will offer his monthly outlook on U.S. grain exports based on the USDA's latest World Grain Supply and Demand Report released last Thursday. Among other things, he'll comment on the reported tightness in global wheat supplies. Then K-State's Mike Stamm will share the numbers from this year's canola variety trials here in Kansas, which reflected an exceptional year for canola yields. And later this week's Wildlife Management segment, where K-State's Charlie Lee discusses a new evaluation of drone flights as a method of taking deer inventories across a given property. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. This is the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in once more. Last Thursday, the USDA put together and released its latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, or WASDE, report, which, of course, included an overview of grain supplies and demand, not only here domestically, but around the world. And it's toward that latter interest that we bring our guest in now. He's with us regularly after each of these WASDE reports is Guy Allen. Guy is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. Guy, this August WASDE report receives fanfare going in because of the expectations of new data, but this one particularly, you say, shifted the perception on the markets a bit. How so?
Yeah, August reports are it's not unusual for them to change market direction, and this one was no exception. We saw changes in wheat, corn, soybeans across all the complexes. Most of that, or a lot of the changes, were actually outside the U.S., although the U.S. numbers were quite important for corn and soybeans particularly. Just to highlight a couple things before we dive in deeper. For corn, the WASDE report was actually quite friendly, with carryout down about to 1.1 billion bushels, up 50 million bushels, and new crop carryout down 190 million bushels to 1.24 billion bushels. Demand, the USDA is sort of expecting that to fade, although I think the trade looked at those corn numbers and discounted them fairly heavily. They think there's more corn out there than what the USDA does, and probably demand being a bit more healthy there as well. Brazil's moving along towards the end of their second crop corn harvest. Still some question on the size of their export program, but it looks like we're going to bridge that gap. Ethanol margins sort of narrowed a bit. Strength in the oil markets. They're looking for a bit of a bounce there to maintain those margins, particularly as we move into fall where cheaper ethanol blends coming in. Soybeans, we've got old crop carryouts projected here at 160 million bushels, up 25 million bushels, and new crop unchanged at 155 million bushels. Thing about soybeans, Monday is the 8th consecutive day we've seen flash sales for soybeans come across in the morning, which has lent good support for the oilseed complex and maintaining some relatively good values there.
When we get into the wheat numbers, though, and as we take that deeper dive, global stocks are tight. The numbers suggested tighter than most had anticipated going into that report.
Yeah, I think the key thing coming out of the wheat numbers was we've got to price wheat out of the feed ration. I think for the last 6 to 8 months we've been, particularly for hard red winter wheat, been pricing a lot of that into the feed ration. And USDA wheat outlook for 2022 is reduced supplies, lower consumption, reduced trades, and smaller ending stocks. And a lot of that's coming from outside the U.S. Supplies are expected to decline by about 16.8 million metric tons, looking at about 1,065 million metric tons. Lower production in Russia with dry weather, and Canada as well as northern part of the U.S. These are being offset by larger production numbers both in the Ukraine and Australia. Canada's production particularly was lowered 7.5 million tons to 24 million tons on the drought situation there across those northern prairies during July and early August. This will be the smallest Canadian wheat crop since 2010-11. On the flip side of that, Ukraine numbers were raised to a record 33 million metric tons on increased area and a slightly better yield. And Australia was also increased by 1.5 million metric tons to 30 million metric tons. After their record year last year, they're looking at a near record, possibly another record crop 2 years in a row. Consumption continues to be revised lower. I think that's a reaction to higher prices, and a lot of that is pricing wheat now out of the feed grains ration, as it's starting to price itself above corn as it needs to. World consumption was dropped by 4.2 million metric tons to 787 million metric tons. Big changes there. And also tightening supplies coming out of Russia and Canada, both with dry weather. And Russia continues to adjust their export tax situation to sort of maintain those domestic supplies.
Guy, these new numbers seem to say that the flow of wheat exports might be out of the norm as we look forward.
Well, look, the balance sheets are still comfortable. I wouldn't say they're uncomfortable, but they're tightening up enough that it needs to be priced out of the feed ration. I guess you do have a dichotomy when you look at the hard red spring wheat, the high protein wheat. That market is in a very, very strong inverse. And when you look at hard red winter wheat and soft red winter wheat, those markets have adequate supplies to put those in carries. So look, big premiums for your high protein. I've got a number of calls over the last couple weeks just asking, querying on how flour millers and bakers may adjust their blends to adjust for the higher cost of protein. These guys don't like to adjust their blends once it works, but there's a significant tightness in that high protein supplies, particularly in the way like this Kansas crop was a fairly soft finish. I think we saw generally lower proteins across the board.
On the coarse grains, corn and otherwise, and you talked about the old crop and new crop situation, but what more would you draw from those numbers, Guy?
On the corn situation, look, it was a bit peculiar, and the USDA took those numbers down for this coming year fairly sharply, but the trade discounted their numbers. I think most of the analysts I've talked to think they're a bit understated, and that's the way the market's sort of been trading, but it did lend some support. At least it hasn't traded lower. If it would have come out sort of as the trade expected, well, I think we could have seen it continue to move lower. So it did stop the fall and present a little support on that. We are starting to price a bit of the demand out according to USDA, and this is also on the back of sort of smaller exportable supplies as well. But I still feel we're going to see strong demand across all the livestock sectors, and that includes into the international trade there as well.
And that also relates to grain sorghum exports. Same notation?
Yeah, grain sorghum continues to be interesting. We watch that pretty closely, particularly with China being the primary buyer of that. Look, all these other importers of sorghum have basically been priced out and switched to corn. Even Japan, they've bought a little bit from Argentina, but we're going to basically be out of sorghum by the time new crop comes around. Argentina's been a bit of a benefactor from that. They've exported 500,000 tons this year so far, and the USDA expects them to export about 1.2 million tons, which is the biggest number they've had for some time. Looking at the U.S. numbers this year, our production this past year was 9.5 million metric tons, and we'll export 7.2 of that. And we'll basically be sitting on an empty tank when our new crop, USDA estimating just under 10.4 million metric tons, and we hope to export about 8.1 million metric tons of that. Again, China being that primary destination as it continues to be a good premium to corn.
And when you bring up China, and you alluded to this earlier, looking at the oilseed side, China, its buying has been dwindling some, but what's the prospect looking forward there?
Well, yeah, China, we sort of watch those imports, and They were down in June, down in July to the lowest level in the past 3 years. I sort of take that as a signal that that feed demand, particularly from the hog sector, just isn't there like it used to be. In the wake of that, the USDA did drop the Chinese import number by 2 million metric tons, dropped it down to about 98 million metric tons of total imports. Also, in that oilseed complex, we're seeing a very, very good premium for oil over the meal. And we're really having a hard look at crops such as canola and sunflowers. Canola is about 44% oil, so it's very weighted to the oil side of the equation. Again, though, that drought we're seeing to our neighbors to the north in Canada, really devastating their crop. USDA dropped that 4.2 million metric tons to 16 million metric tons due to the drought. The Russian sunflower crop was also lowered a million metric tons to 15.5. That said, Ukrainian production of sunflowers and Australia production of canola was up again and slightly offsetting some of that drop.
So some give and some take here. Your general sense of the state of our export outlook then out of the U.S.?
Well, I think we've got things a bit more comfortable than we did 2 months ago. That's basically with the drop in demand, particularly out of China, but a few other places as price has sort of done its job of rationing demand there a bit. But we are still looking in this coming marketing year, carry out stocks for corn and soybeans are historically tight, and wheat is now tighter than it's been for a number of years, and it can't afford to be priced into feed grains. So we're sort of removing that safety net there a bit. So I think we'll get through harvest in a fairly comfortable fashion at these higher price levels, but should, I think, provide some pricing opportunities later in the coming marketing year.
Greatly appreciate your perspectives on those USDA numbers, Guy, as they come along monthly. And if we might, we'll have you back a month from now to take a look again. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Guy Allen, over from the IGP Institute at K-State, where he serves as the senior economist on the IGP staff. Once more, his take on the USDA's latest World Grain Supply and Demand report here on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today returns now. When you look back at this past canola production season in Kansas, you'll find by the numbers it was an outstanding canola production go-round. And we're going to get into that and why canola fared so well this past year as we look ahead as well to the planting season, which isn't all that far from now. Canola agronomist, K-State Research and Extension, Mike Stamm, has agreed to come by and visit with us once again. You were just giddy about how canola went this year, and it points to largely the weather conditions, does it not, Mike?
Yeah, Eric, when I wrote that e-update article from a couple of weeks back, I had a hard time finding an adjective that would describe the year that we had in our research trials, and I came up with exceptional. It really was an exceptional year for canola yields, and as you mentioned in the intro, it was related a lot to weather.
Recap that, if you would. Cooler temperatures at just the right time, in essence.
Right. As we remember, April and May were below normal in terms of temperatures, and in some parts of the state it was pretty dry. Central, northern Kansas, we had a bit more moisture to deal with, but it was really that April and May that allowed the canola to really flourish. So we had an extended bloom period, for one thing. The canola it seemed like it was just week after week after week we saw yellow flowers in the field. And then, eventually starts filling in with pods. And that extended grain fill that we had based on those cooler temperatures really added to the density of the number of pods we had in the field, as well as pod size. All those different yield factors really contributed to the yield. So the crop really filled in the empty space like I had never seen before. And we just had these huge, dense canopies, especially in the central and northern part of the state. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
But the story began even before those favorable spring conditions, did it not, Mike, going clear back to the fall?
Right. We had great conditions for establishment last fall. Overall moisture was adequate for stand establishment. And, that's what we tell growers all the time. It really starts with getting a good stand in the fall. And so we had that going into the winter. And, initially the winter was pretty mild until we got to that major February cold snap. And we were worried, of course, about the canola crop when we were down to minus 20 there for that time period. And it was just really amazing how the canola came through. Part of that was due to the snow cover that we had across much of the state at the time. That certainly helped to insulate the crop. But also just the level of winter hardiness we've been able to elevate in the crop now was really beneficial to getting through that cold period. And when we went out to rate winter survival, we really didn't see any winter kill because of that major cold snap. So the varieties, in combination with our management, getting a good stand, and the environment all kind of played into the canola surviving through that major cold snap.
That really was a strong testimony to the genetic improvement that your program has generated in the canola that we plant currently now, and that's gratifying to see, Mike. Now, we're referring, as we go along here, to the data that you have collected from your field trials. It's part of the National Winter Canola Variety Trial. How many sites did you maintain this past year?
My program maintains 4 sites in the state, and then we have 2 outside collaborators as well. So for a total of 6 locations here in the state. And the first location is down around Norwich, Kansas, and that was the part of the state that really experienced drought conditions that impacted yields. Now, yields were still really good, in my opinion, at that particular location. Both open pollinated and the hybrid variety trials averaged just over 40 bushel to the acre, and 40 bushel is really our target year in, year out for the crop across the state. So overall, it was average to just above average for that site, but we definitely saw the impacts of the drought there with a shorter crop, thinner stands, and we didn't see those dense canopies like we saw in other parts of the state.
And talk about what you did observe at those other locations. There was another site not far from the Norwich location at Hutchinson, and in southwest Kansas too, but then you move further to the north and see some remarkable yield numbers.
Yeah, it was impressive. As we moved north in the state, the yields really started to increase. And as we moved to the Hutch site, we saw yields average in the 60s. Some varieties pushed 70, even 80 bushels at that site. There we had more moisture than we'd had at Norwich, but denser canopies and just a taller, more robust crop. And just overall, the evenness and the consistency of the crop across every field, not just at Hutchinson, but at the other fields, was just remarkable this year. We certainly saw that at Hutchinson. As we moved to Manhattan, yields went up another notch there too. And we're talking 70, 80 bushel canola here at Manhattan. And it was trial after trial after trial. And I gotta run the combine for most of the of harvest, and it was just really encouraging to see the yield consistency this year. That was, in addition to the high yields, that was really remarkable to me. It was just from one trial to the next, it was the same. We were 70 bushel, 70 bushel, 70 bushel. And again, going back to the conditions that we had in the spring, that lent a lot to that.
And further to the north and the west, at Colby and at Belleville in particular, those numbers just jump off the page, Mike.
Yeah, for the first time in my career working with canola, we topped over 100 bushel at the Belleville site. And I was not expecting the site to yield that much. Again, we had those heavy, dense canopies, but going back even to 2012 at that site, we had a remarkable year there where we averaged almost 90 bushel to the acre. Well, this year even topped that year. And again, the cooler weather in the spring had a lot to do with it. The crop was well protected during that cold snap, and just timely rainfall really contributed to the high yields at Belleville. So overall, just one of the best years that we've had with the canola breeding program. And it's really encouraging for me just to see that we can attain those yield levels, the same yield levels that we were seeing in the wheat crop across the state this year. So it's just a testament to we're doing the management that we need to, and we're starting to see some of the variety development come around to where we can attain these high yields, especially in these years where conditions really work out like they did for the winter crops.
And to that point, how important was this kind of highly productive year to canola production in Kansas in the broadest sense, and building those acres back up, Mike?
I think it's really important. It's definitely a reminder to our growers that we are capable of growing this crop down here. Now, I'm well aware of the challenging conditions we can have in the spring. Just a couple years back with heavy rainfall throughout the month of May and the challenges it caused with harvest. So that pendulum can swing back and forth for sure, and it certainly swung in our favor. But overall, when we have these years where we have exceptional yields in an alternative crop like canola, we generally see an uptick in acres. And so I would certainly encourage producers to dive into the data that we provided in that e-update, to ask questions about the varieties if they have them. And I'm certainly available to do that because I want to help farmers make sense of the data that we've put out this year, because I think it can be extremely useful. And it's good for the breeding program to have these good, consistent years just to see how things are progressing in terms of yield potential.
Mike references it. If you go back to the Agronomy e-update newsletter dated July the 29th, you will find the article and the rundown on the performance trials for winter canola in Kansas this past year. And that's at agronomy.ksu.edu, the July 29th edition once more. And before we let you go, because we will have you back a little later on as we push towards September, Mike, planting dates, we're not there yet, but we're not very far at all from those.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that in a month we'll be dropping breeding nursery in here close to Manhattan. So it tells me it's near. So, when we think about planting dates in Kansas, of course, in northern Kansas, that's when the crop needs to go in the earliest. So those, first 10 to 15 days of September are critical for northern Kansas growers. For central Kansas, we're looking at September 10th to approximately September 25th or so for ideal planting window. And then as you get into the southern part of the state, we can plant into the early part of October, but, by September 15th, we're ready at the edge of the field, anxious to plant this crop. And hopefully we'll get this rainfall that we've been having here to continue so that we have adequate soil moisture to seed into this year.
Let's look for a sequel to 2021's production in 2022.
I would certainly like to see that. It's a lot of fun to process this data and then plan for this coming year when you have these good years.
Once more, check out the results of Kansas entries into the National Winter Canola Variety Trial, agronomy.ksu.edu. And we'll talk variety selection in more depth when you're back next. Mike, thank you for coming over.
Sounds good. Thank you, Eric.
Canola agronomist, K-State Research and Extension, that's Mike Stamm. When we come back after the break, today's agricultural news headlines are coming your way, as is this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State's Mike Brouk, and more. Stay with us, won't you? This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, which is now in its 97th year of broadcast service to agriculture here in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson here. Now on to today's agricultural news headlines for you, and beginning with the Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report for this week, out yesterday from the USDA. For the week ending this past Sunday, topsoil moisture around the state, 2% surplus, 52% adequate, and 46% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 2% surplus, 55% adequate, 43% short to very short. The Kansas corn crop, 62% good to excellent, 24% fair, 14% poor to very poor. Corn silking, now up to 97%. Corn in the dough stage, 74%, and in the dent at 25%, which is behind the 36% average there for this date. Soybean crop condition also 62% good to excellent, 28% fair, 10% poor to very poor, with soybeans blooming at 85% and beans setting pods now at 60%. The grain sorghum crop 62% good to excellent, 30% fair, and 8% poor to very poor, with sorghum headed now at 75% and sorghum turning color at 15%. Range and pasture conditions in the state this week, 49% good to excellent, 33% fair, and 18% poor to very poor. For the overview of corn and soybean conditions nationwide now, we turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says the latest crop progress numbers reflect this summer's Midwestern weather.
Drier to the west and hotter as well, and then abundant showers and thunderstorms east of the Mississippi River. The net result was a decline in corn and soybean conditions, not unexpected with continuing drought problems in the western Corn Belt.
First, he looks at corn condition.
That dry weather in the west continues to take a toll on the crop. And looking at the national numbers this week for August 15th, we see 62% of the U.S. corn rated good to excellent, 13% very poor to poor.
This is a slight drop from last week and considerably lower than the same time last year. Soybean conditions also took a slight tumble.
We're looking at just 57% of the crop rated good to excellent, down 3 points from last week. 15% very poor to poor. That's a 2-point increase.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Additionally, nationally, grain sorghum now headed at 83%. That's 3% ahead of the 5-year average. Sorghum coloring at 31%, and the condition of the grain sorghum crop in the nation, 60% good to excellent. That's down 3 percentage points from last week. As for the spring wheat crop, harvest continues to speed along there, jumping another 20% last week, reaching 58% completion. That's 22% ahead of the 5-year average, but the spring wheat condition held steady at only 11% good to excellent. That's still the lowest good to excellent rating since 1988. Bayer AG has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review the landmark Roundup case, arguing in a petition filed yesterday that a federal appeals court committed errors in the case brought by non-Hodgkin's lymphoma victim Edwin Hardeman. Bayer said in its petition to the Supreme Court that the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco had committed 2 errors worthy of review. The company said state law failure to warn claims at the center of the case were preempted by federal law, and the admission of expert testimony departed from federal standards, leading to what Bayer said was unsupported testimony on Roundup's safety profile. In 2019, a jury awarded Hardeman $80 million in damages after the ruling that his lymphoma was caused by his use of Roundup. Those damages were later reduced to $25 million. Bayer has faced thousands of similar lawsuits connected to the glyphosate-based product. Next, it's on to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning corn silage harvest. This past week I've had the opportunity to participate in some meetings in a couple of states north of us, and one of the things that really was debated a lot in our discussions with producers up there was this idea of when should we pull the trigger on chopping the corn silage. Should we consider whole plant moisture, or should we be more concerned about where the milk line or where the starch development might be in that kernel? You know, as we debated this back and forth, there's kind of a fine line and maybe a balance that we have to seek there between where we're at with whole plant moisture as well as where the kernel is at in terms of starch development, particularly when we're chopping this silage for dairy cows, and we want to have something that is just as nutritious as possible. As I discussed with producers, it's really critical that we have enough plant moisture. So, where is that maximum level of dry matter that we would really like to chop at? It's really probably about 38% dry matter or 62% moisture, and that's on a whole plant basis. So make sure you chop a few stalks and try to determine where you're actually at before you pull the chopper in the field and start putting up tons and tons of silage that might be either too wet or possibly even too dry. In other words, you waited too long. So really checking here the next couple of weeks is going to be really, really important. See where we're at with whole plant moisture. My concern is it looks like we're going to go through a spell of warm weather again, actually fairly hot weather. That's going to tend to cause our fields to lose moisture fairly quickly. So count on losing at least a half point of whole plant moisture a day, maybe upwards to a full point if we have hot, dry winds out of the south, and temperatures that are above 100 degrees or near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's get back to the starch end of this and talk about the kernel development. One of the problems we have when we have drying conditions during corn silage harvest is plants tend to die and they lose moisture fairly quickly. Starch development really isn't going to progress. So trying to wait for additional starch development sometimes is not the right decision. If your corn silage, if the whole plant moisture is below 62%, or if the dry matter is going above 38%, you really need to harvest it, regardless of where we're at on kernel development. If you can wait a few more days and give that corn an opportunity to mature just a little bit more, in other words, you have enough plant moisture there, it's worth the wait. Every 2 to 3 days of additional starch development, in other words, grain development, at this stage of the game will really increase the percentage starch in the corn silage, which increases the nutrients that your cows can get from the corn silage that you're chopping. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully balance whole plant moisture against starch development of the grain as they harvest corn silage.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today. Closing out this Agriculture Today now, it's our weekly wildlife management segment featuring former K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. The emphasis this week is on management, Charlie, and the value of inventorying deer populations for the purposes of management, whatever one's objective might be. The techniques for doing so can vary, can't they?
Certainly a lot of different techniques for surveying deer populations or surveying wildlife populations. We know on the issue of deer that managers at times want to reduce deer, and we've talked about methods of controlling damage caused by deer many times. However, there are also those individuals out there that want to manage deer numbers for deer population management. And that could be to try to increase the quality of the herd, change the sex ratio of the herd, or reduce the density so that deer numbers are more in line with habitat that is available. But there's always been some discussion about which is the best survey technique. Spotlight surveys are one of the most common methods for estimating white-tailed deer population size and densities. It's one of the techniques that Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks utilizes. Those surveys are conducted using a high-powered spotlight along existing road networks and using distance sampling methods. That means observers in the back of the vehicle are using a laser rangefinder and a protractor to measure the angle of which the animals are spotted from the vehicle as it travels down the road. Then they're able to get a good measure of the width of the area in which they sample. Without the angle and the distance finder, it's very difficult to come up with an accurate area. So you may come up with a number of deer observed, but you aren't able to get good density information. The use of that distance sampling technique has been criticized because roads are known to affect deer movements and distribution. So if you're not able to access where the deer are, spotlighting surveys are not a very good technique. So you look for other techniques. Some of those survey techniques we've also talked about, and that's just simply keeping track, writing down the numbers that you see, when and where. But again, that's probably not going to give you the actual population size or density that you may need for management purposes. So unmanned aerial vehicles, or sometimes called drones or quadcopters, are being used more frequently to provide better estimates of wildlife numbers. They can be utilized not only to provide numbers of the deer that are in the area, but also to give you some estimates of the habitat quality. In fact, there are more and more farmers that are using drones to keep track of the amount of damage that may be caused by deer or elk or other big mammals in crop fields that they're not able to find otherwise. So they seem to be a tool that has some good application. They're relatively inexpensive depending on the quality and the features that you get on a UAV. And there's been some recent research on how accurate they are compared to spotlight surveys when censusing deer populations and densities.
And that study took place on the East Coast, you say, conducted by researchers out of the state of Missouri. The premise being here that that drone may have some inherent advantages in accessing deer and capturing their numbers and in various habitats. What was conducted here?
Well, it was on 2 national historic parks in Virginia and in West Virginia, as well as a secondary site in Maryland on national historic parks. They were able to program their drone to fly transects and overlap those transects using a thermal imaging camera, then come back and looked at the still images or when they had a return, and were able to get what they think was a very accurate number based on the thermal imaging camera. They had 4 different observers look at the images. All came back fairly similar with numbers that they could interpret from the UAV flights, and found that they seemed to be much more accurate than spotlight surveys. In fact, they thought that spotlight surveys may significantly underestimate deer densities, and perhaps by as much as 2 to 3 times. So that tells me if we're relying on spotlight surveys to give us information about deer densities, we're not using the most accurate information. Keep in mind, these are often just used as trend indices, meaning it doesn't really matter the accuracy of the technique if you're comparing year-to-year data. But when you start trying to use them as area or population densities in a broader scope, we need more accurate information.
Saying that about drones and how they can be more effective in gathering information, if one would want to deploy a drone for the purpose of taking a deer count, how might they maximize that performance?
Well, one of the first things to do is make sure that you do a good job of programming the UAV flight lines. They need to be distributed randomly across the entire area of interest. That may be one individual farm, it may be a county, or it may be a deer management unit. Then you get population estimates that are based on the targeted area. You have to keep in mind that there are some weather conditions that may impact results, particularly cloud cover and precipitation, and unusual high temperatures in the area may cause some false readings from heating of landscape elements like rocks or bare ground, tree trunks that give you a false reading. And some of that just is a matter of experience with the technique and looking at the imaging that the drone produces.
But those things considered, those drones, those unmanned aerial vehicles could serve a favorable purpose here, it sounds.
Yeah, I think they're something that for the person that has everything, it may be one more tool to help them fine-tune their management abilities.
And in this case, managing deer populations for whatever end purpose by the use of drones to get those counts as accurate as possible. That was recently studied. Charlie reporting on that research with us today. Thanks, Charlie. Former K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee with us. Our time's away once again. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.